Chapter 7. I woke up early, a whole hour before my alarm. School was out, but I still got up early. I had butterflies in my stomach about going to the league tryouts. I bolted upright in my bed with one overwhelming thought. What was I even supposed to wear? I shook my head. Even so, first impressions are everything, and I didn't really know what was appropriate for this kind of thing. Do you wear a costume? Something so that you're ready to fight and go through some combat training drills if that's what they ask you to do? Or maybe it's more like a job interview, where you wear your nicest clothes to show respect for the others who are higher up on the totem pole. After a quick shower, I laid two separate outfits on my bed. First, my coat, tie, and khakis, my one nice outfit for all respectable occasions, weddings, funerals, or school pictures. Next to it, I spread out my old wetsuit, which I hadn't used since last summer, when I decided that although riding a wave was pretty fun, fighting 50 punks named Laird all day for the same dinky set of waves wasn't all it was cracked up to be. The wetsuit might be put to better use fighting crime instead. I zipped up the wetsuit and stared at myself in the mirror. It looked enough like a costume to pass. I glanced at my bedsheets and instantly decided there was no way I'd wear a cape. Dad had always told me that unless you know how to move with a cape, they just get in the way. More often than not, he said, they were a tip-off of a real amateur, and the last thing I wanted was for everyone at tryouts to think I was an amateur. I looked at myself standing there in my wetsuit, my baseball high tops on my feet, and I chucked the high tops in the back of my closet and put on my black army boots instead. They looked tougher, and they didn't stand out as much as the white sneakers. Then I had a minor panic attack. What if everyone else wore respectable clothes? Would they think, who the hell does this clown think he is? The Silver Surfer? I nearly pulled my left arm out of joint trying to get my white Oxford shirt over the wetsuit. As long as I didn't breathe too much, I was able to button up the shirt and put on my tie. My arm sort of stuck out, propped up by the cushion-like effect of the wetsuit underneath. I looked at myself in the mirror. Not bad. I heard the door close downstairs, and I looked at the window and spied Dad, impeccably dressed in his old uniform, as he walked out onto the front porch. It was so early that the paperboy was pulling up to our driveway on his dirt bike. The kid took one look at my father and did a double take, like he was trying to figure out if today was Halloween or not. With his good hand, Dad took the newspaper out of the dumbstruck kid's pouch, and with a gentle flick of his wrist, casually tossed it over his shoulder so that it landed perfectly square on the front doormat of our porch. Dad pulled the keys out of his utility belt, climbed into his old Camaro, fired it up, and slowly pulled out of the driveway. The paperboy didn't move a muscle until Dad's car had disappeared down the street. I wandered into Dad's closet and pulled an old sport coat out of the back rung. It was dark and caked with dust, but it fit nicely over my wetsuit, so I wiped it down and put it on. Downstairs, I grabbed my backpack, shoved a piece of toast in my mouth, and saw a note Dad had left for me on the front hall table. Tom, gone to the funeral. Good luck at the game today. Sorry I won't be able to make it. Dad. I had told him I had an away game this afternoon, a couple hours drive across state. Under normal circumstances, he would have picked out that lie with just one or two questions. Like, for instance, hey, what's the name of the school? But in his state, all he could do was apologize for not being able to make the trip. The toast felt funny in my stomach. It didn't mix well with the guilt. The bus is the slowest mode of transportation ever. It dropped me off downtown about half an hour late, so I ran to the park. When I finally got there, the memorial service was already halfway over. The park was overflowing with people, most of them either weeping or trying to get a look at the celebrities in the front row. I'd never seen so many people in one place in my life, and it was weird to see them overcome with emotion for someone who was a complete stranger. I nudged my way past a candlelight vigil and a large family whose mother was passing out sandwiches to all the kids from a giant igloo cooler. Then I nearly tripped over an elderly woman in a wheelchair who apologized for getting in my way. He saved me during the disaster attack of 63, picked me up and scooted me right out of the path of the death ray, he did. She looked like, of course, I would remember that incident, like my scrapbook was filled with her clippings, and I smiled back politely before I climbed past her through the crowd. Silence spread throughout the masses, and I saw all heads turn up and look to the sky. The League descended from the clouds and landed on the stage. Justice hovered up to the microphone to deliver the eulogy, and I heard a female fan's distant scream from the outer reaches of the crowd, over by the porta-potties. "We love you, Uberman!" A cool trickle made its way down my forehead, and my eye stung with the salt of sweat. The wetsuit was boiling hot underneath the sport coat. I wiped my brow with the sleeve of Dad's old jacket and tried to listen, but the reverb was so bad on the sound system, only the closest few hundred people could actually hear Justice. There was an endless train of testimonials from people who all thought they were more famous than the next. A few ex-presidents who'd kept in the public eye mostly as guests on cable news shows, some old movie stars, a couple of young journalists who waxed on about Victory's legacy, and with words like resonant and zeitgeist. All I could think about was how I never remembered seeing a single one of these people anywhere near that dank nursing home whenever Dad and I visited the old-timer. My nostrils filled with a familiar smell, and my eyes scanned the grounds for the gardenias. The smell always reminded me of my mom, since they were her favorite flower. I didn't see any gardenias anywhere nearby, but I knew they must be there. I looked at my watch, and suddenly I was worried about getting a head start on the crowd. I didn't want to be late for tryouts, plus I needed a Gatorade. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and turned to leave when I spotted my father crouched behind a lighting crew, where he'd managed to steal a spot near the stage. He knelt on one knee, and his eyes looked heavy as he listened intently to the speaker. He didn't see me. The slew of celebrity mourners streamed off the stage after the service, and I lost Dad in the crowd. I was nervous that he'd bump into me and ask why I wasn't at my game. I wiped more sweat off my forehead and contemplated making a run for it, but my eyes caught a glimpse of Uberman, still up on stage with the rest of the league as they paid respects to family and friends of the deceased hero. I'd never seen Uberman with such a look of genuine sadness on his face. He rightly hugged a girl who I assumed to be one of Captain Victory's attractive great-grandnieces, and she cried into his chest, right in the spot where I'd always imagined my head would rest at night when he and I drifted off to sleep together in our beach house, with our golden retriever puppy nestled peacefully at our feet. Suddenly I saw Dad behind Uberman at the foot of the stage. He approached Justice, who was engaged in conversation with the mayor, and tapped him on the shoulder. Suddenly my stomach felt sick, and although I couldn't put my finger on it, I thought it was really wrong for these two to talk. It could only lead to disaster or shame or both. Justice glanced over his shoulder and saw my father in his old uniform. Neither of them said a word at first. They just looked at each other, until finally the mayor filled the awkward silence and excused himself to join another conversation on the other side of the stage. I couldn't tell what was passing between them. My dad didn't give away much. If he'd gone in for gambling, he would have been a world-class poker player. Justice wasn't giving away much either. I moved up behind the trunk of an ancient old oak tree for a closer look. Then Dad did something that freaked me out. He balled his good hand into a fist and lifted 3 fingers into the air. Justice met the gesture, raised his own fist in the air, and lifted 3 fingers. Then, just as quickly, Justice lowered one. Now there were 2. They both grew solemn and looked down at the ground between them. It felt like the wind had been knocked out of my legs, and I actually gasped out loud. Suddenly I understood exactly what was happening, exactly who they were to each other. I couldn't believe I hadn't recognized him when I met Justice in person. Dad and Justice were recreating Mom's picture, 3 generations of the world's greatest heroes, except now only 2 remained, my father and his sidekick. I ducked behind the oak and rested my head against the giant trunk and caught my breath. I'd witnessed something I was never meant to see. Justice had been the hero formerly known as Right Wing. He gripped my father's hand in a firm shake, the kind old war buddies give each other when they meet years later, survivors. I didn't know what to make of this. I guess it made sense that Dad never mentioned he knew the leader of the League, what with his devout bias against superpowers. Still, you'd think it would have come up at some point. I stole away from the tree and tried to block all the new questions out of my mind. All that mattered was the League tryouts, and I needed to get my head together for it. I weaved in and out of the folding chairs stacked in piles like giant headstones and hurried out of the park. I caught the next bus and headed across town to the secret location. What was it that felt so wrong about what I'd seen? Why did I have the same feeling you get the first time you hear your parents have sex? Shit, my watch had stopped again. I don't know how late I was. As soon as the bus stopped, I sprinted the rest of the way there, sweat pouring down my forehead, and my 2 outfits clung to my body like a heavy, wet blanket. When I arrived at the address on the invitation, an abandoned tire warehouse with broken windows and rusted doors, I was sure it had all been a joke, an elaborate setup to humiliate me. Then I realized I wasn't important enough for anyone to go through all this trouble just to make me feel stupid, and I rang the worn button marked delivery. Without a sound, the door swung open, and I hurried down a sleek, steely hallway to an open elevator. I stepped inside and noticed there weren't any buttons for the floors. The doors began to close, and I briefly thought how stupid I'd been to go to some strange place and put myself at such risk without letting anyone know where I really was. If something were to happen, who would know to come looking for me? As far as Dad knew, I was at a basketball game out of town. My mind raced with possibilities. What if it was one of Dad's old adversaries out to exact revenge? That seemed like a hollow endeavor to me, especially after all Dad had been through in recent years. But you never know. I felt my heartbeat quicken when it struck me that Mom, too, probably had droves of her own adversaries who wanted payback for the years they'd spent in jail. I tried to relax by breathing deeply through my nose. Finally, the elevator door opened, and I walked across the slick marble floor of the waiting room in front of me. I stopped in front of the reception desk. The receptionist, a pert little thing who looked more like a morning's television personality than a super temp, uncapped a black Sharpie magic marker. "Your name, please?" My eyes scanned the waiting room full of wannabe heroes. Some of them read old issues of Men's Health and Cosmo from the magazine racks. Some of them stretched out, hoisting a leg over any free spot they could find on a sofa or side table. Some practiced whatever it was they were going to impress the league with. One guy chatted away, a little too loudly if you ask me, to what sounded like a broker on his cell phone. I couldn't tell if he was looking at me through his Ray-Bans, but I was pretty sure they were purely cosmetic, not meant to contain gamma radiation or something like that. A couple of costume crusaders laughed at an off-color joke by the water cooler. "I need a name, please." There was a hint of sharp edge to the perkiness. It's Tom." She looked up from her "Hello, my name is" sticker and stared at me in the eye. "Tom Creed?" I ventured. Shit. Only teachers end statements with question marks like that. And I really didn't need to come off sounding like a dumb teenager who didn't know what he was doing. She popped the cap back on her Sharpie and smiled tightly. "I meant your alias." Her lips were pursed, and I couldn't tell if she thought I was just a total amateur or if I was messing with her or both. Oh, right. My alias. It had never occurred to me that I might need one. I glanced around the room for some sudden inspiration, but all I could come with was the potted plant, the fruit platter, or free subscription. "Justice invited me," I said. "The rest of the league, too." Like that would be an excuse for this whole silly name thing. She slid her trendy horn-rimmed spectacles down her nose and gave me the once-over. Then she leaned back in her chair, opened the Sharpie, and began scribbling something on the name tag. "Suit yourself." She unpeeled the sticker and smacked it on my lapel. "We'll be calling you in groups every 15 minutes. Have a seat. By the way, love the tie. Next." And she was on to the next person waiting in line, some guy with oversized purple wings. "Oh, hi, Lester." She leaned over the desk to kiss him on the cheek. "How are Fran and the kids?" I managed to find a quiet little spot over by a potted plant. I looked down at my tie and realized I was the only person there without a costume. I thought the act of disrobing in public might be a little embarrassing. Maybe I'd go to the bathroom and change in a stall. My collar was soaked with sweat. I walked over to the refreshment table and swiped a few napkins to dry off my forehead and the back of my neck. I wish I'd taken the time to get a Gatorade. I joined the line at the water cooler to pour a cup. When it was my turn, I couldn't seem to get the nozzle to work, and the line behind me was growing impatient. I tried to distract the guy in back of me with small talk. He wore a high-tech visor, a tight blue lycra suit with a symbol of an icicle on his chest, and a permanent frown. "Hey, how crazy is this water cooler?" He stared at me. I cleared my throat. "Do you know how to get this thing to work?" I asked. "Most people pull the nozzle." I, of course, was pushing it. I heard a few would-be heroes snicker behind him. I pulled the nozzle with force, and a torrent of water knocked the cup out of my grasp. The water splashed on the guy with the visor and immediately froze upon contact with his skin. The line of heroes glared at me. I picked up my cup and skulked back to my space. No one bothered to look at me after that, and right then I knew I could use a familiar face. Most of the candidates were at least 10 years older than I was. In fact, the only person in the room who looked close to my age was the pizza delivery girl who just walked in. I watched her check in with the receptionist. Then she came over and sat in an armchair next to me. She set her stack of pizzas in her carry bag down on the floor beside me and picked up a magazine with a cover story on NASCAR racers. She crossed her leg and bounced one foot up and down as she read and chomped on a piece of gum. Her face seemed perky and friendly. I glanced down at her tiny body, and I thought she was probably a cheerleader or high school gymnast when she wasn't busy delivering pizzas to hungry superheroes. "I'll take mine with extra cheese," I said in her direction. She stopped reading the magazine and looked straight ahead, like maybe a mosquito was buzzing in her ear, but she wasn't sure yet. Then she turned in my direction. "What did you say?" "The pizza," I said. "I'll take mine with extra cheese." She adjusted her blonde ponytail, which poked out of the black hole in her cap, and glanced at my name tag. Then she went back to her magazine. I was just saying I'm glad someone had good sense to order some real food. I lifted the corner of a pizza box for a peek. What do you got in there? She swatted my hand away with a magazine. Hey, hands off. She hoisted her delivery bag, and I heard her mutter Twinkie under her breath as she moved to a new seat on the opposite side of the room. I looked up sheepishly and saw practically everyone in the room staring at me. Even the guy with the cool shades got off his cell phone to see what the matter was. I bent down and pretended to tie my shoelaces just so I'd have something to do. Her insult stung, and I kept thinking about the venom in her voice, the way she said Twinkie, emphasis on the twink. I stole a look at her and saw that she was wearing a name tag with codename Miss Scarlet. Once again, I was the village idiot. She wasn't delivering pizzas. She was trying out for the team. Psst. I straightened up. Who was psting me? I looked over my shoulder to the right and saw a guy having a major sneezing fit. He pulled a couple of tissues out of his utility belt on his costume. He blew his nose loudly, checking the contents, then pinched his nose to stop the bleeding. Psst. I looked in the other direction, over my other shoulder, and saw an old lady waving me over in her direction. She had her skirt hiked up above her knees and was massaging her left calf muscle. A network of spider veins spread down her legs and disappeared under her boots. Be a doll, kid, and help me pop my knee joint back in place. Her name tag read, Hello, my name is Old Enough to Know Better. Don't you need an alias? I asked. She looked at me and chuckled. Nope. Now go ahead, reach down, grab my thigh, and give my boot a good yank. Some of the heroes looked up from their magazines and wondered what the heck this kid was doing reaching up this old lady's skirt. Don't be shy. Give it some oomph. More people were staring by now, and I figured the harder I pushed, the sooner I'd get it over. Yeah, that's it. Ow! Her knee made a nauseating pop, which reminded me of the sound my ankle made when I rolled it during the state finals last year. She leaned back in her seat and smiled. God, thanks for that. Pass the tired old woman her cigarettes, will you? I handed her a padded flip-top cigarette case, and her arthritic fingers popped open the fastener, pulling out a Pall Mall, and fired it up with the alacrity of a woman half her age. Knee's been doing that ever since I got the replacement last year. Kinda burns whenever you do your thing with your hands, huh? I nodded and thought about that for a second. How'd you know I could do that? She inhaled a deep drag from her cigarette. I see the future. She exhaled to the side, careful not to blow smoke in my direction. I'm Ruth. Nice to meet you, Tom. She shook my hand and smoke came out of her nose. The guy with the sneezing fit and the nosebleed on the other side of the room began to cough. How'd you know? Oh, right, you can see the future. Powers are weird. No, she took another long drag and gave it the longest Granny Ash I'd ever seen. I can see your name tag. Embarrassed, I looked down at my name tag. The receptionist had written my name in big, bubbly cursive letters. The receptionist appeared in front of us and leaned down with a patronizing smile. Excuse me, there's no smoking in here. She extended a cup of water in our direction for Ruth to put it out. Ruth held up a finger, not the one she really wanted to hold up. Just a sec. She took one last deep drag of the cigarette that burned it all the way down to the filter. There. She popped the cigarette butt into the glass, and it made a little hissing noise when it hit the water. Perfect timing. She gave the reception a quick look and said, thanks, but that really meant you can leave now. Then a woman in an expensive but ill-fitting business suit and a tight perm entered and called for our attention. She introduced herself as Suze from Human Resources and passed out a phone book, thick stack of paperwork for us to sign, and began to explain the contents of the packet. Confidentiality agreements, liability forms, non-discrimination clauses, which I noticed left out anything about sexual orientation. My eyes had glazed over by the time she got to the personality inventory. I looked over to the door. Where was Uberman? What was he doing right then? Did he remember me? Suze caught me daydreaming and clapped her hands twice. Come on, people, listen up. This is really important. I looked over at Ruth, fast asleep in her armchair next to me. The guy who'd been sneezing nonstop in the corner raised his hand and asked Suze where the bathroom was and ran from his seat as soon as she pointed him in the right direction. About an hour later, I looked down at my packet and saw that I had only completed about half of it. Suze wandered into the room and looked over everyone's shoulder. She stopped at the pizza delivery girl. The pizza girl looked up from her paper at Suze. Mind your own fucking business. My mind drifted over to the door with the League's inner sanctum behind it. Their secret meeting room, their simulated combat session gymnasium, their museum of treasures from past adventures, the living quarters of the team. And what would Uberman's room look like? Something modern and architectural, I'm sure. No clutter, but lots of style. A Spartan simplicity so he could wake up and pound out 1,000 push-ups and sit-ups before a full day of saving people. Later, he would crash on his platform bed to read a thoughtful and sensitive novel before falling asleep, preferably to some soothing music of my choosing. And where was Justice? Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see him standing with my father, both of them stoic on the platform, neither of them saying a word, just holding up 3 fingers that became 2. Some other questions began to form in my mind, like, where was Justice when my father, his mentor, was disgraced in the eyes of the world? Where was he when Dad couldn't get work? Where was he the month after Mom disappeared and Dad had to drink himself into a stupor just to pass out for a few hours of sleep at night? What the hell did anyone need a sidekick for if they weren't there for you when the chips were down? Dad had been there for Captain Victory to the very end, even through the depressing nursing home years. It's easy to be there for someone when everything's coming up roses, but how about when someone really needs you? Suddenly, all I could think about was finding this guy and telling him who I really was, and that I needed some answers before I went any further with this whole charade. And if that wasn't something he felt like he could talk about, then he could take his super tryouts and shove them up his "Welcome, everyone, welcome." A warm, booming voice echoed as Uberman glided into the room. I leaned forward on the edge of my seat and smiled. I couldn't wait for him to recognize me. "We're ready for the first group." He looked down at the clipboard in his hands. "Let's see. Mass Master, CompuKid, Kung Fu Carla, and the Human Stain." Uberman shook their hands and ushered them through the door, which closed automatically behind him. I folded my arms and dropped back into the chair and racked my brain about the things I was going to do to impress them.